Elijah Carter stepped into the courtroom knowing he was already at a disadvantage. The judge barely concealed his amusement. The opposing attorney smirked with overconfidence, and the gallery whispered, certain of the outcome before the case had even begun. Elijah was not a lawyer. He had no prestigious degree, no legal team, and no powerful allies. He was simply a man fighting to keep the home his late mother had left him, refusing to be another casualty of a system that valued profit over people. But what no one in that room realized was that Elijah had spent every waking moment for months studying the very laws designed to push people like him out. And today, he was prepared to expose the truth. The opposing attorney, Daniel Harrington, spoke with the effortless ease of a man who had won countless cases just like this one. He laid out the legal argument in broad, sweeping strokes, portraying Elijah as a man who had simply failed to meet his obligations. The law, he argued, was clear, and the facts were irrefutable. Elijah listened, his hands steady, his expression calm. He had expected every word of this. But when it was his turn to speak, he did not rely on emotions or plead for sympathy. Instead, he let the facts speak for themselves. He presented two versions of the mortgage agreement, one with a signature from his mother, and one supposedly signed after her death. The room grew still. A smirk twitched on Harrington's lips, but it faltered as Elijah continued. With each piece of evidence, Elijah dismantled the case against him, exposing forged documents, illegal property transfers, and a pattern of corporate fraud. The judge, who had once looked at him with quiet condescension, now leaned forward, his expression unreadable. The moment was shifting. Elijah was not just defending himself. He was turning the tide. By the time he was finished, there was no doubt. This man, the one they had all underestimated, had just proven himself to be the smartest person in the room. Elijah Carter stood at the center of the courtroom, a man alone against a system that had already written him off. Across the aisle, Daniel Harrington exuded confidence, adjusting his cufflinks as if the case had already been decided. The judge, who had barely acknowledged Elijah at the start of the proceedings, leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. To them, Elijah was just another desperate man grasping at straws, another defendant who lacked the education, the experience, and the power to challenge them. But what they failed to see, what they had always failed to see, was that intelligence does not come with a title, and persistence does not require permission. Harrington delivered his arguments with the polished ease of a man who had done this 100 times before. His voice was smooth, his gestures precise. He painted Elijah as irresponsible, as someone who had simply failed to meet the terms of his mortgage. It was a familiar script, and he delivered it well. But Elijah did not waver. When his turn came, he did not rush, did not stumble over his words. Instead, he spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he was right. He laid out his evidence methodically, one document at a time, pointing out inconsistencies, exposing contradictions. And then, with deliberate precision, he placed two mortgage documents side by side, one allegedly signed by his mother and another bearing her name months after her death. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Harrington's smirk flickered, a crack in the wall of certainty he had built around himself. The judge leaned forward, his amusement replaced by something else, something close to concern. The room, which had felt so firmly against Elijah only moments ago, was shifting. He was no longer just a man fighting for his home. He was a man proving that truth, when wielded with knowledge and determination, could bring even the most powerful to their knees. Elijah wasn't just defending himself. He was forcing them all to see that they had underestimated the wrong man. The weight of Elijah Carter's words hung thick in the air, settling over the courtroom like an undeniable truth. He had exposed something they hadn't been prepared for, a crack in the foundation of what they thought was an airtight case. The mortgage documents, the mismatched signatures, the undeniable proof that the foreclosure was built on deception. The judge, who had barely given Elijah more than a passing glance at the start of the trial, now studied him with a new kind of scrutiny. There was no more amusement in his gaze, no more condescension. The laughter that had once echoed in the room had been replaced with a heavy silence, one that even Daniel Harrington, the high-powered attorney, could not break. Harrington shifted in his seat, his carefully practiced confidence now laced with something else, uncertainty. He cleared his throat, an attempt to regain control. "Your Honor," he began, reaching for a rebuttal, but the judge raised a hand, cutting him off. His attention remained on Elijah. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, his voice measured, "are you telling this court that the foreclosure was based on falsified documents?" Elijah met his gaze without hesitation. "Not just telling you, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady. "I'm proving it." A murmur spread through the courtroom as the realization settled in. What had started as a simple property dispute was no longer about missed payments or legal deadlines. It was about fraud. It was about a system that had assumed it could erase Elijah's story, dismiss him as just another case file, another number in a long line of evictions. But he had refused to be silent, refused to be overlooked. He had taken their own weapons, the law, the evidence, the very rules they had relied on to strip him of his home, and turned them against them. He wasn't just fighting for his house anymore. He was exposing a truth they had hoped would never come to light. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the courtroom. Elijah Carter had done something no one had expected. He had turned the case on its head. What was supposed to be a routine legal proceeding had now become something much bigger. The judge, once indifferent, now leaned forward with a look of keen interest, his fingers tapping lightly against the bench. Daniel Harrington, the seasoned attorney who had entered the room with an air of superiority, was now visibly unsettled. His carefully rehearsed confidence was cracking, his composure slipping as he scrambled to regain control. Elijah, however, remained steady. He knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about his grandmother's house anymore. It was about exposing a system that thrived on deception, that counted on people not having the knowledge or the resources to fight back. He had spent months poring over documents, cross-referencing records, learning the legal loopholes that corporations use to strip families of their homes. And now, in front of a judge, a jury, and an attorney who had underestimated him from the very beginning, he was laying it all bare. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every eye was on Harrington, waiting for him to respond, to justify the unjustifiable. But he had nothing. His mouth opened, then closed, as if he was grasping for an argument that no longer existed. Elijah could see it in his face, the realization that he had lost, that for once, the system had not been able to bulldoze over the little guy. The judge turned his attention back to Elijah, his voice carrying an authority that made everyone sit up straighter. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone devoid of the amusement he had once held, "I believe we need to take a closer look at this case." The power in the room had shifted, and Elijah Carter had just rewritten the rules. The courtroom, once filled with quiet murmurs of doubt and dismissal, now held an undeniable tension. Elijah Carter had done what no one expected. He had forced the system to confront its own flaws. What began as a routine case, one that the opposing attorney assumed would be an effortless victory, had transformed into a battle for justice. The judge, who had once regarded Elijah with skepticism, was now leaning in, flipping through the documents with a furrowed brow. The weight of truth had shifted the room, and everyone could feel it. Across the aisle, Daniel Harrington, the corporate attorney who had walked in with the confidence of a man who always won, was visibly unraveling. His polished demeanor, his easy smirk, gone. He gripped the table, scanning the evidence Elijah had presented, desperately searching for a way to discredit it. But there was nothing. The signatures didn't match. The transfer documents were incomplete. And now, with the entire courtroom watching, the cracks in his case had become undeniable. Elijah didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His voice remained calm, measured, as he spoke the words that sealed the moment. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. My grandmother's home was taken under fraudulent circumstances, and I believe that's not just a mistake. It's a crime." The judge exhaled slowly, setting the papers down. There was no immediate ruling, no dramatic pounding of the gavel. But everyone in the room understood what had just happened. Elijah hadn't just defended his grandmother's home. He had exposed a system that thrived on deception. And now, standing in the very place where he was meant to lose, he had made it clear. Underestimating him had been their first and biggest mistake. The air in the courtroom had changed. What had once been a place where power and influence dictated the outcome now felt like a battlefield where truth was finally given a voice. Elijah Carter stood firm, his presence no longer that of an underdog fighting against impossible odds. He had shifted the tide. The judge, who had initially dismissed him, now studied the documents with a rare seriousness, his expression no longer amused, but weighted with realization. Across the aisle, Daniel Harrington sat frozen, his confidence drained. He had entered this room certain of victory, certain that a man like Elijah, without a legal degree, without corporate backing, could never dismantle a case built by seasoned attorneys. But he had been wrong. Elijah's evidence was undeniable. The fraudulent signatures, the missing endorsements, the bank's reckless foreclosure tactics. Piece by piece, they had built a wall of deception, assuming no one would ever look close enough to tear it down. But Elijah had. Not because he was trained in law, but because he refused to let injustice go unchecked. He had spent months studying, learning, preparing, knowing that when the time came, he had to be more than just right. He had to be undeniable. And now, standing in front of a judge who could no longer ignore the truth, he had proven his point. The silence in the courtroom spoke louder than any argument. Everyone knew what was about to happen. The power dynamic had flipped, and for the first time, the corporate machine that had taken so much from hardworking families was being forced to answer for it. Elijah turned to face the judge, his voice steady. "Your Honor, all I ask is what my grandmother deserves: justice." And in that moment, it was clear. Justice was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. The courtroom, once filled with quiet condescension, now buzzed with the weight of realization. Elijah Carter had done what no one thought possible. He had turned the case on its head. The judge, who had initially dismissed him with a smirk, now leaned forward with intent, no longer entertained, but fully engaged. Across the aisle, Daniel Harrington, the seasoned attorney who had entered the room with effortless confidence, now looked like a man grasping for control. His carefully curated arguments had crumbled, his once unshakable position now riddled with doubt. Elijah stood firm, unwavering in the storm of shifting power. He had not come here with degrees or titles, but with truth and the determination to make it heard. He had spent months poring over every document, every technicality, every loophole the bank had used to rob families of their homes. He knew their tactics better than they did. And now, standing before a judge who could no longer ignore the evidence, he had forced the system to face its own corruption. The silence in the courtroom was no longer one of doubt. It was one of reckoning. The judge let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the bench. The ruling was inevitable now. The foreclosure had been built on fraudulent grounds, the signatures falsified, the mortgage transfers incomplete. Elijah had not just proven a case, he had exposed a system designed to prey on the powerless. As the judge prepared to deliver his decision, Elijah turned to the gallery, where others who had suffered under the same injustices watched with wide eyes. This was not just about his grandmother's home anymore. This was about every person who had ever been told they didn't stand a chance. Today, he had shown them otherwise. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a dense fog, heavy with the realization that everything had changed. The arrogance that once filled the opposing attorney's voice had vanished, replaced by a quiet desperation as he scrambled for an argument that no longer held weight. The judge, who had initially regarded Elijah Carter with amusement, now studied him with measured respect. This was no longer a formality, no longer just another case on the docket. It had become something more, a reckoning, a moment where justice had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Elijah remained composed, though inside, his heart pounded with the gravity of what he had accomplished. He had walked into this courtroom as an underdog, underestimated and dismissed, yet he had dismantled an entire case, with nothing but persistence and the truth. He had shown that knowledge was power, that the system could be challenged, and that even the most formidable forces could be held accountable. Across the room, murmurs spread through the crowd, people whispering in disbelief, in admiration, in newfound hope. The judge exhaled and adjusted his glasses before delivering the verdict. The foreclosure was declared void, the property was to be returned immediately, and further investigation into the bank's fraudulent practices would commence. A quiet gasp rippled through the room, but Elijah did not move. He simply nodded, absorbing the moment, knowing that this victory was not just for his grandmother, but for every person who had been wronged by a system designed to favor those in power. As he gathered his papers, he felt the eyes of the courtroom on him, not in mockery, but in recognition. He had done what they all thought was impossible, and now no one would ever underestimate him again. The story of Elijah Carter is more than just a courtroom victory. It is a testament to resilience, intelligence, and the unshakable power of truth. It is a reminder that justice is not reserved for the wealthy or the well-connected, but for those who are willing to fight for it. Elijah stepped into that courtroom with nothing but his determination and his belief that right would prevail, and he proved that knowledge is the greatest weapon against injustice. He refused to be intimidated, refused to be silenced, and in the end, he not only won the case, he exposed the corruption that so many assumed was too big to challenge. This story is not just about one man standing up for his family. It is about every person who has been dismissed, every individual who has been told they don't belong, and every fighter who has ever been underestimated. Elijah Carter reminds us that no matter how much the odds are stacked against us, we have the power to challenge them. He turned doubt into determination, ignorance into awareness, and injustice into accountability. And that is what true courage looks like. But the fight does not end here. Across the country, there are countless others facing the same struggles, battling systems that are designed to work against them. That's why it is more important than ever to stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop fighting for what is right. If this story inspired you, if you believe in justice, and if you want to see more stories that expose the truth and empower the people, subscribe to Civil Rights Fight today. Because change does not happen in silence. It happens when voices rise, when truth is revealed, and when people like Elijah refuse to back down.